In 633 CE, the Battle of Chains was the first strike of the early Muslims against the great Persian Empire of the Sassanids. The Arabs would conquer the entire empire within 20 years, while at the same time fighting a second front against the Romans. Not since Alexander the Great had a Persian empire been conquered so quickly and completely. Before he died, the Prophet Muhammad had promised that the Muslims would conquer the East and the West. But before that could happen, the Arabs had to believe that they could take on the Sassanids and win. The great Persian empires had represented the height of civilization, culture, and raw military power for 1,000 years. Could desert Arabs ever challenge an elite army from the most advanced and powerful empire in the world? The Battle of Chains proved it was possible. Leading the Muslims was General Khalid ibn Walid, a companion of the Prophet Muhammad who had dubbed him the Sword of Allah. Khalid is easily one of the greatest generals in history, and this battle is an example of his genius in warfare. Prior to this campaign, tribes in eastern Arabia had been launching lightning-fast raids into Persian territory. They were returning with abundant booty and spoils of war. Their leader, Muthanna, reported the weaknesses of the Persian defense to the first caliph, Abu Bakr. Khalid was in the city of Yamama in eastern Arabia, having just defeated the rebel and false prophet Musaylama the Liar. He was commanded by the caliph to take the capital city of Al-Hira in Iraq. The goal was to liberate the Arabs of the Persian Empire and spread to them the new faith of Islam. Khalid, with only 2,000 soldiers under his command, sent the caliph Abu Bakr a letter asking for reinforcements. In response, the caliph sent one man, Qaqa ibn Amr, to reinforce Khalid's army. When challenged that he was only sending a single warrior, the caliph responded, quote, "No army can be defeated if its ranks possess the likes of this man," unquote. Khalid, now in the city of Yamama, raised an army of volunteers and joined with the Arab tribal raiders to form the largest ever Muslim army in history up until that time. 18,000 Arab warriors would be facing the most experienced, well-equipped, and technologically advanced army in the world. Khalid sent the following message to Hormuz, the Persian governor. Quote, "Submit to Islam and be safe, or agree to the payment of the poll tax, and you and your people will be under our protection. Else, you will have only yourself to blame for the consequences, for I bring the men who desire death as ardently as you desire life." End quote. Hormuz, offended by the demands of inferior Arabs, assembled an army of 20,000 elite soldiers to teach these upstart barbarians a lesson. Hormuz, knowing that Khalid was in Yamama and would approach from the south, marched his army down from Uballa, the provincial capital, to the town of Kazima and readied his army for battle. He arranged 2 wings of heavy cavalry on either side of a strong center of heavy infantry, surrounded by his light Arab infantry. The Persian heavy infantry in the center bound themselves into groups of up to 10 men together with chains. The name of this battle comes from the chains of the Persian center. The Arab auxiliaries mocked the Persian chains, observing that they made them sitting ducks for the enemy. The Persians retorted that the Arabs were cowards and wanted to be free to flee. The Persians wore the chains because they were extremely effective at preventing a breakthrough in their ranks. They also served as proof of their courage and willingness to die in battle and never retreat. And why would they think they would ever have to retreat against undisciplined Arabs? As Hormuz waited for the Muslim army, he sent out his scouts. However, they could find no trace of Khalid. Hormuz may have thought that the Arabs were bluffing. Unexpectedly, Persian messengers came rushing to him warning that Khalid's army was spotted heading towards Hufayra. His base Uballa was vulnerable. His lines of supply and communication were exposed. Khalid did not take the direct route as expected. Instead of approaching from the south, he marched his army up from the southwest, using the Arab advantages in the desert as cover. Instead of moving in one slow column, he split his forces into 3, all traveling within a day's march of each other. This would increase the speed of the army and allow them to concentrate again quickly when needed. Sun Tzu in The Art of War said, quote, "Quickness is the essence of war," unquote. Khalid's army traveled close to the desert so that they could retreat into safety if needed, and the Persians would not follow. Hormuz, now outmaneuvered, made a forced 50-mile march to Hufeira. When he arrived, he immediately redeployed his army. As the army waited for the Muslims to appear and engage them in battle, they again were nowhere to be found. Scouts were sent out and hastily returned. Khalid was on the move again. This time, he was heading back to Kazina. Sun Tzu says, quote, "All warfare is based on deception. When we are near, we must make the enemy believe we are far away. When far away, we must make the enemy believe we are near." End quote. Hormuz again sent his army on another 50-mile forced march back to Kazina. The general was hungry to finally meet the always slippery Arab raiders in battle and crush them decisively. This second march destroyed morale as the Arab auxiliaries began to grumble, and the Persian army was growing tired as they had made 3 marches carrying heavy armor and weapons. Sun Tzu says, quote, "If the enemy is in superior strength, evade him. If your opponent is temperamental, seek to irritate him. Pretend to be weak, that he may grow arrogant. If he is taking his ease, give him no rest." End quote. As soon as Hormuz arrived, he again deployed for battle, with the center chained together. Meanwhile, Khalid's army was taking their time getting to Kazima, waiting for the Persian enemy to get there first. This is where he decided he would stand and fight. What explains Khalid's erratic behavior? Why did he march to Hufeira in the first place when he could have marched directly to Kazima? Khalid was a master strategist and was well aware of the strengths and weaknesses of the Muslims and the Persians. Sun Tzu said, quote, "If you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles." End quote. Khalid knew that Hormuz's army had better weapons and the heavy infantry was better armored with chainmail, breastplates, metal helmets, gauntlets, and greaves. These advantages came with a cost. The Arabs, lightly armored and equipped, could travel much faster and with less exertion with their horses and camels. Khalid's goal was to manipulate Hormuz into making forced marches that would exhaust his men and give the Muslims the advantage on the battlefield. Sun Tzu says, "Victorious warriors win first and then go to war, while defeated warriors go to war first and then seek to win." End quote. When Khalid arrived at Hufeira, he could have made directly for Uballah, but then Hormuz's army would be able to flank him and cut him off from the desert. So he knew he had to defeat them first before taking the city. As for his march from Hufeira to Kazima, he traveled leisurely through the desert, but not so deep that Hormuz's scouts could not find him. He wanted to be seen, so the Persians would give chase. The other disadvantage of the Persians was their arrogance. They thought they were dealing with primitive Arab raiders and not an army hungry for conquest. If someone had told Hormuz that Khalid's mission was to conquer the great city of Hira, he would never have believed it. Sun Tzu says, "When the enemy is strong, avoid them. If of high morale, depress them. Seem humble, to fill them with conceit. If at ease, exhaust them. If united, separate them. Attack their weaknesses. Emerge to their surprise." Khalid's trap had been set. The Persians were exhausted and the Muslims were rested and hungry for victory. They were ready to finally meet their enemy on the battlefield. But little did they know that Hormuz had an ace up his sleeve. The time had finally come for the two armies to meet. The sword of Allah, General Khalid ibn Walid, and 18,000 Muslim warriors had finally arrived on the battlefield. This would be the first time in history the Persians would meet a Muslim army. The Sassanid general Hormuz eagerly readied his 20,000 Persian soldiers. The Arabs had long memories and deeply feared the Persians. 300 years prior, the legendary king of the Arabs, Imr ul-Qais, dared to challenge the Sassanids. This ended in a catastrophe. The emperor himself marched at the head of his army and crushed the upstart Arabs, destroyed their capital city, massacred all the men, and enslaved their women and children. Ever since then, the Arabs were treated with utter contempt. The Caliph Abu Bakr needed a psychological victory to demonstrate to the Muslims that the Persians could in fact be defeated and that the Prophet Muhammad's promise was true. Meanwhile, General Hormuz was thirsty for combat. For months, Arab raiders were a growing nuisance that would never meet a Persian army in the field. They would unexpectedly emerge from the desert wherever the Persians were weak, capture whatever spoils they could, and disappear as quickly as they came into the desert. As the military governor, being unable to protect his territory from these barbarians embarrassed him. This was his chance to crush them and get revenge. When the Muslim army was in position, Hormuz trotted forward on his horse alone. He called out Khalid for single combat. Fearless and ready to meet any challenge, Khalid rode out to meet him. Hormuz bravely dismounted, giving him no chance to escape if things went badly. Khalid followed his lead and drew his sword. The two generals traded blows, but when neither man was able to get the upper hand, Hormuz stepped back and dropped his sword and shield. He goaded Khalid into a wrestling match. Never one to back down, he followed suit and engaged Hormuz with just his bare hands. The two tussled until Hormuz was able to lock Khalid into an iron grip. This is when he put his treacherous plan into motion. At that moment, he gave a signal to his swiftest assassins hidden in the front ranks of his army to charge and kill Khalid while he was trapped. It's a testament to his strength that he was able to whirl around, attached to a fully armored Hormuz, using his body as a shield against the attackers. But he still couldn't get free of his grip. Both armies burst into an uproar, the Persians in delight and the Muslims in a rage over the duplicity. It was because of this noise that the assassins could not hear the hooves of an Arabian battle horse bearing down upon them. It was Qaqa ibn Amr, the one-man reinforcement of the Caliph, dramatically arriving on the battlefield just in time to see the treacherous plot. He rushed to Khalid's aid before any of the Muslims had time to react. The lone rider decapitated the attackers, freeing Khalid, who then was able to finish off Hormuz himself. The Persians fell silent in shock, and Khalid seized the moment and ordered the Muslims to charge. The swiftness and skill took the Persians by surprise. Who were these Arabs that could fight in formation with such ferocity? The Arabs they knew were opportunistic raiders that would cower in fear at the very sight of a Persian army. This was different. Despite the death of their general and the zealous onslaught of the Muslims, the chained Sassanid heavy infantry repelled the charge. The Persians fought bravely and repelled attack after attack. Eventually, the fatigue of the forced marches took their toll and the Persian lines began to falter. The two cavalry wings were pressed hard and retreated. The Arab auxiliaries and any unchained Persians followed them. The Persian center, still bound together with chains, attempted a retreat but was too slow to escape the swiftness of the Arabs. They were surrounded and completely destroyed. Their chains had sealed their fate. The Muslims had handily won their first battle against the Sassanid Empire, suffering only minor losses while routing the enemy. As the war booty was collected and distributed, the Arab army could now outfit themselves with superior weapons and armor. And they would need it, as another force had already been sent towards the city of Uballah to secure it against potential raids and, if needed, reinforce Hormuz against the Arabs. The general of this army was Qarin, a high-ranking member of the Sassanid court. He was making his way south and was crossing his army over a river when he received word of the defeat at Kazima. Incredulous that an Arab army could defeat the Persians, he waited for the remnants of Hormuz's army to join with him and report. The Persians and their Arab allies bickered and blamed one another for the defeat. Qarin, now more cautious, camped and kept his army close to the river to protect his rear. He also made sure the boats were ready just in case they were needed for a retreat. The Muslims raided the countryside for supplies but could not draw Qarin away from his camp. Thus Khalid himself scouted Qarin's army and found no way of outmaneuvering his opponent. Unlike Hormuz, he was less willing to underestimate the Muslims. There was little choice left for the Arab army but to fight a set-piece battle on Persian terms. Khalid marched his army to meet Qarin on the battlefield. 16,000 Muslims faced off against 22,000 Persians. The Arabs matched the Persian formation with infantry at the center and cavalry wings on either side. Like Hormuz before him, Qarin came forward from the center formation and challenged Khalid to a duel. As he rode out to meet him, this time, a zealous Muslim soldier named Maqal charged to meet the challenge. Khalid, knowing he was a champion, let him fight. When Qarin was cut down, the commanders of the Persian wings, veterans from the Battle of the Chains, and eager for glory after humiliation, came forward demanding single combat. The commanders of the Muslim wings rode out to meet them, and both generals fell quickly to Muslim lances. The Persian army, having lost their 3 senior commanders, was shaken. Khalid called for a general charge, and for the second time a Muslim army clashed with the Sassanids. It's a testament to their discipline and courage that the Persians were able to hold their lines and repel the Arab offensive without their senior generals. Eventually, demoralized and without capable leaders, the army lines grew increasingly chaotic and confused. When the Arabs broke the Persian formation, the army began a panicked retreat to the river. The more mobile Arabs gave chase and routed the army with minor losses. The Persians, on the other hand, suffered 10 to 15,000 casualties. Had it not been for Qarin leaving the boats on the river, the entire army would have been destroyed. The Sassanid Emperor Ardashir learned of this defeat within hours. He was both incredulous and furious. How could uncivilized Arab barbarians crush 2 Persian armies led by elite generals? He resolved to crush the Arabs decisively and immediately ordered 2 more armies to converge on the Muslims and overwhelm them. The first army was dispatched immediately to slow the Arab advance, and the second would follow soon after and join with them. Khalid had just defeated 2 Persian armies and was now on the verge of fighting 2 more. The brazenness of this Muslim invasion of the Sassanid Empire bordered on suicide. After defeating 2 armies, they were being hunted by 2 more much larger armies with no backup. The element of surprise was now gone, and the Muslims were now being treated as a serious threat. Rather than retreat against these odds, Khalid pushed forward towards his objective, the city of Hira. To further illustrate the point, when Alexander the Great set out to conquer Persia, he had nearly 50,000 soldiers, a modernized army, and cutting-edge military technology. Alexander had elite heavy infantry and cavalry at his disposal. Veterans he had inherited from his father. He also had generations of Greek knowledge and experience on how to fight the Persians. In contrast, 18,000 poorly equipped Muslim soldiers marched out of Arabia with only light cavalry and infantry. They were tasked with capturing a major Persian city with no reinforcements and were learning how to fight the Persians on the fly. This military campaign was historically unprecedented. The next battle, in my opinion, is the one that cements Khalid ibn Walid as the greatest general in history. So make sure to share and subscribe so you don't miss out on my next video. Thank you for watching. Adam out.